All right, so in this video, we're going to talk about how to improve your relationships. We'll begin with the idea that relationships are important. I probably don't really need to try very hard to argue that relationships with your boss, your coworkers, your employees, and your customers are very critical to your success at that job. Probably, I would argue, more critical than the actual skill you have doing at that job. If your boss loves you and your coworkers want to help you and your employees love you and your customers love you, you're going to be very successful. Getting a job is also very much influenced by relationships. 70 to 85% of jobs are acquired because of networking. Referrals increase your application success by like 500%. In addition to relationships being important in our career, relationships are also one of the biggest predictors of our happiness and our health. Psychologists right now are talking a lot about what they call the loneliness epidemic. We've seen a doubling of our loneliness rates, such that now 40% of American adults report loneliness, and the assumption is that that number is actually probably much higher. But in addition to it increasing, we've also had an increasing understanding of just how consequential loneliness is. It reduces the lifespan as much as smoking and more than obesity. Loneliness is associated with more heart disease, more depression, anxiety, dementia, suicide, stroke, stress, insomnia, aging. At some ages, being lonely actually doubles your likelihood of dying. And it's also associated with worse decision making, worse creativity, worse performance at work. So having good relationships really, really matters. And yet, lots of people aren't great at them. And so that's kind of what we're talking about today. Before I wanted to get into that, I wanted to talk a little bit about how relationships influence success. So this brings us to Adam Grant's research. And Adam Grant's a professor at Wharton, and he wanted to know how our approach to relationships influences our success in life. And he decided that there's basically three types of approaches. There are givers who approach a relationship saying, how can I help this person? There are takers who approach a relationship saying, what can I get from this relationship? How can I benefit from it? And then there's the majority of people, something like 50 or 60%, who are matchers. These are people who are kind of in between and who are very responsive to the relationship partner, right? If you help me, I help you. And so the question is, who's more successful in life? And he looks at engineers and how good they are at their engineering job. He looks at medical students and how good they do in medical school. He looks at MBA students. He looks at salespeople and how good they do at their sales jobs. And across all of these very diverse domains and very diverse ways of measuring success, he finds the same pattern. One of these types of people is overly represented at the top of the success ladder, and one of them is overly represented at the bottom. And so maybe pause the video and see if you can guess who does the best and who does the worst. I've asked this question to many students. It's generally a pretty even spread. No one really has any idea. And so here's the answer. It turns out that the people who tend to do the worst, overly represented at the bottom of success in all of these different fields, are givers, which is unfortunate. But if you talk to these givers, you find that they basically just give all the time, and that can be problematic for them. It gets interesting because the people who are overly represented at the top of the success ladder, if you look at the really, really successful people in all these fields, you find a lot of givers. So the givers either do really, really well or really, really poorly. And some givers actually perform better than the majority of us who are matchers. Takers tend to do pretty well at first, but then all of these matchers kind of catch up to them. I'm onto your game. I know what you're doing. I'm not going to help you anymore. And in fact, I'm going to try to destroy you. That makes it hard to be a taker and be very successful. But this idea that some givers do really well and some givers do really poorly leads us to some really interesting questions. What can the givers who do so bad at life learn from the givers who do so well? And what can these matchers learn from these givers who are so successful? How do they beat the matchers? And what Adam Grant basically finds is that the givers who do very poorly are those who don't protect their time. They say yes unconditionally, and they just don't really have any sense of like, I need to get my own stuff done. Whereas the givers who do really well are those who can say, yes, I want to help you, but I'm not going to be very helpful if I can't get my own studies or my own job done. So they're a bit still different from a matcher. They want to help. That's their goal in their relationship, but they put some boundaries up. Another way in which these givers who do really, really well are different from the matchers is that they have this very rich social network of people who kind of owe them a favor and want to help them. And so these givers that do well have the ability to take advantage of that, to call in those favors, to use that social network in useful ways. And often that takes the form of, you owe me a favor, this guy needs help, you're going to help him, and I'm bringing this all together without too much work of my own. And of course, having lots of givers is really, really useful for the success of an organization. So hire givers. And so what we're going to talk a lot about here is the idea that relationships often don't work out very well. There's a lot of threats to relationships. They're very important, but we're kind of bad at them. One of the major ways in which we're bad at them is something we talked about in the decision-making video, which is the idea that lots of people are biased in favor of things that feel good to think, such as, I'm great, I'm right in this disagreement, that wasn't my fault, I'm really good at stuff. For all of these biases, you can see how that they would really destroy our relationships. If I refuse to admit something is my fault, if I think I'm always right in any time in which you and I see the world differently, if I just think I'm great and I'm engaging in lots of planning policies, so yeah, sure, I'll be there on time and nothing goes out very well, then I'm going to be not a great relationship partner. In addition to this bias, I think there's a really big bias that doesn't get too much attention from researchers, but it's about biased accounting of gives and takes in relationships. And so we've talked about how matchers are kind of keeping track, okay, I'll help you if you help me. But at some level, I think everyone is kind of keeping track of what they're giving and receiving in relationships. And so you can think about it as kind of an accounting T account. So we've got here a hypothetical situation between, let's say, two roommates, Tom and Mike. And so Tom is keeping track of what he gets out of this relationship and what he gives. And he's, of course, going to be motivated to continue this relationship and motivated to help out this person if he feels like he's giving more than if he feels like he's getting more than he's giving. And so we have this idea that Mike does Tom a favor, and Tom's like, sweet, this is worth something to me, we'll call it $5. In this case, let's say maybe Mike does the dishes and they're roommates. Now, if Tom does the identical favor, it's probably a bigger deal for him, right? He's doing the dishes, he's in the filth, it's like really salient and vivid, and he's scraping the crust off of this guy's disgusting pan. It weighs a little more heavily on him. That's kind of unavoidable, right? Your roommates do the dishes, you barely notice, maybe you don't notice at all. You do the dishes, and it's this very vivid, extreme experience. And you can think about this in other domains too. Someone gives me a ride to work, and yeah, it's not a big deal. They weren't so busy. I'm pretty awesome, so them spending time with me is kind of a gift on its own. Whereas I give someone else a ride to work, and didn't they know how busy I was, and I was in the middle of a game, and my time is so valuable, that's a really big deal. And so we can see how receiving and giving, even just the same favor, can result in this bias in terms of your kind of credits and your debits in your relationship. And of course, over time, this will play out in a more and more extreme way, where you're more and more confident that it's this person's turn to do the dishes, or they owe you a favor, or you aren't getting as much out of this relationship as you were putting in, and that's going to lead to a lot of problems. And of course, this happens for all kinds of relationships. If you feel like your colleague at work is constantly benefiting from your help while not giving you much in return, you're going to kind of stop helping that person. Same for your customers, your boss, your friends, your family, your relationship, your romantic relationship partners. You're keeping track of the score and all of these things, and you're doing so in a biased way, and that's really deteriorating how much value you're getting from these relationships. I would expect most people watching this video, your roommate thinks it's your turn to do the dishes, you think it's their turn to do the dishes. You're kind of in a tough situation because of this biased accounting. And so the solution, I think, is try to recognize this bias, try to really practice putting yourself in someone's shoes. If they've done the dishes, take a second and recognize just how unpleasant that is. Say thank you. But also maybe try to be less serious about this keeping track. If you're a giver, you're happy to help other people anyway. You recognize that the pillow that best comforts us on our deathbed is feeling like we helped a lot of people in our life. So be a giver, try to help out, and that'll help with this bias as well. But of course, there's other types of conflict. There's other ways in which we feel threats to relationships. We've talked about takers and matchers and biased accounting just now, but a major source of conflict is just the idea that everyone's different. And so you see on this little figure, people see the world differently, right? We've all have different genetics. We've all have had different experiences in our life. We've all experienced different information. And we should be good at saying, oh yeah, you've had a different life. You might see it that way. I see it this other way. This is fine. But we're actually quite bad at this. We see these differences as threatening, and humans respond to threat with a fight or flight reaction. We have this situation where we've evolved to fit a world that no longer exists. We're really good at responding to physical security, safety threats, like some animal attacking us. That's what our threat system is very well evolved to do. But it's very poorly evolved to respond to relationship conflicts. These fight or flight reactions are really useless and problematic there. And so what happens is someone sees the world differently, we freak out, we're convinced that we're right and they're wrong, and we need to get them to see it our way. And we're very bad at resolving conflicts. I would argue that this is probably the thing that humans are worst at, is resolving conflicts. And so that's going to ruin a lot of these relationships, which we've talked about are so valuable. And so I think practicing better conflict resolution, trying to be a giver, trying to recognize things from their point of view, trying to get over some of this bias that screams at you that you're the one who's correct and they're wrong. And if they weren't such an idiot, they'd see it your way. That's really key for the success of our relationships. Another big one here is we have a lot of stress and frustration. Again, probably because we have evolved to fit a world that no longer exists, and living in modern society is very challenging for us. Something like a stressful job, you've got all this fight or flight adrenaline reaction, and it's not helping you at all. It's actually terrible for your health, and it's going to be taken out on the people around you. So if you're stressed out from one aspect of your life, and then you go home, you're quite likely to take out that stress on the people around you. And of course, your most valuable relationship partners are the ones who are around you the most. So you've got a big problem on your hands. Another big problem I think we have as humans is boredom. We tend to habitualize and automate things and take the path of mental least resistance. We tend to stop investing in our relationships once we, kind of feel like we have secured them. And of course, that deteriorates the value there too. So lots of threats to relationships. I'll go even deeper down this course with a relationship bootcamp. And so here we're going to talk basically about the psychology of romantic relationships. I think this stuff applies to work relationships, friendship relationships as well. And this is a little bit beyond my specialty, but I've taught it to a few classes and I think people have really enjoyed learning it. So here goes, relationship bootcamp. The biggest theory I think in relationships is attachment theory. And so attachment theory basically says that people have these different attachment styles, and those styles we have because of how we were raised, specifically how our primary caregiver, often our mother, responds to our signals of need. And so we kind of see in the fourth column there, mother's responsiveness to her child's signal. If your main parent had a quick, sensitive, consistent style, you probably have developed a secure attachment style throughout your life. But of course, some parents are more distant and disengaged, which makes us have an avoidant style. Some parents are inconsistent. Sometimes they're there and they're loving us. Sometimes they're nowhere to be found. And that makes us kind of insecure, ambivalent, anxious. And of course, some people have terrifying and traumatic childhoods, frightened by their parents, and of course, that's going to lead to a very difficult attachment style. This then influences how we approach relationships throughout our entire life. If you're one of the majority of people who's lucky to have a secure attachment style, you're good at intimacy, you're good at conflict resolution, but not all of us are so lucky. If your parent was this distant, disengaged person, then you have this avoidant style in that lower left. And in this case, basically, you've learned that you can't rely on other people to satisfy your needs, and so you become very self-reliant. If your parents were more inconsistent, sometimes they were there, sometimes they weren't, then you become kind of obsessed with like, how can I please this person? How can I make their problems go away? How can I make them care about me? Which of course is kind of you being needy and demanding and really overly invested in relationships. And these things tend to play out even more so in conflict. And so you can see how you'd have a big problem on your hands where there's a conflict and one person is avoidant and they're like, I don't need this crap. And the other person is really clingy and desperate to fix it and like obsessed about it. That's going to lead to a challenge. So I think recognizing what attachment style you have, what does your partner have, and recognizing the source of this can be a good way to understand some of your problems. And of course, tons and tons of research on this. These attachment styles dictate not only how we respond to conflict, but also how we respond to our partner's positive behaviors, relationship relevant distress, relationship irrelevant distress, and so on. If you're interested in this, I'm sure you can find a place to read more. Next, we've got Gottman, John Gottman's Four Horsemen. And so John Gottman is a famous relationship theorist because he brings people into his office. He videotapes them talking about a problem that they have, right? A disagreement or a conflict in their relationship. And he can code that disagreement, how they code that conversation for how much they engage in four different characteristic behaviors. And by looking at that, he can predict divorce rate over 90%. And so the question then is, well, what are these four horrible things that people do while talking to their relationship partner about difficult things that lead to divorce? And the answer is his four horsemen of the marriage apocalypse. Criticism, which is not saying, you know, hey, that made me feel bad. It's why you're so insensitive. You don't care about me. So it's kind of attacking the person as opposed to the behavior. Contempt is the worst of these. You just think they're an idiot. Of course, that's a problem. Defensiveness is basically, this wasn't my fault. The gut is screaming at you that this wasn't your fault. 50-50 chance it was your fault. And so that's a really big problem in relationships that actually leads to divorce if you're trusting your gut whenever it screams, this wasn't my fault. And finally, stonewalling. This is probably kind of some of those avoidant people. I don't need this, screw it. I don't want to talk to you about this. That's not a great approach to relationships. It's good to cool down, take 20 minutes, take a few hours, come back, talk through this thing, and do so in a way that doesn't use these, and you're much, much less likely to be divorced. I'm sure you can click this link or read more about John Gottman's research. Finally, we've got the love languages. This is one you've probably heard of. It's pretty quick and cute, but true. The idea here is that people have ways in which they feel loved: acts of service, receiving gifts, words of affirmation, quality time, and physical touch. But we all kind of have different valuations of these things. Some person may have words of affirmation as the main way that they can feel loved. Tell me how awesome I am, tell me how much you love me, and I'll feel like we have a good relationship. And these gifts that you keep giving me don't really do it for me. So the problem here is we tend to express love in the way that we want to receive it, but different people want to receive love in different ways. And so often we're kind of missing the mark here, where we're constantly getting gifts and they're constantly trying to spend quality time with us. And actually what we want is the exact opposite. Last slide, more relationship tips. One of my biggest ones is ask advice. If you want your boss to feel like he's on your team, if you want your colleagues to feel like you respect them and that they want to help you, asking advice is amazing. It's the biggest compliment we can get. And it has this kind of interesting psychology where once you ask me for my advice, I feel like I'm on your team and I'm your mentor, and whatever I can do to help you, I will. And of course, that's exactly how you want your boss to feel about you. Say thank you. This is kind of goes back to some of that biased accounting. Practice a little bit of that compassion, recognize when someone has gone out of their way to help you. This is big in my life as a researcher, PhD student, and professor. It's really easy to just say, hey, you know, I know you ran this study for me and it didn't really work out, so here's what you did wrong. It's a lot better to say, thanks, that was probably a lot of work. Here's what you can do next time, right? Express that gratitude, goes a long way, makes people want to keep helping you. We've got a lot of these problematic emotions. Recognizing emotions is a really good step. There's a big mindfulness training background here, but labeling our emotions can make us better at handling them. I'm angry. I wonder why that is. Am I hungry? Am I tired? Am I actually mad at this person did? Is it because they kind of touched some deep nerve? Or is it because of some repressed frustration from my job? Wait until you cool off. Try not to take your frustration out on people. Another one is encourage each other's growth. We tend to adapt to things that satisfy our needs really quick. We'll talk about this in the happiness video. One thing we don't adapt to is growth. And so if you feel like this person is helping you grow, that's going to make you value that relationship a lot more than if you feel like this person is, making you feel warm and safe. Another big one, I think, especially in romantic partners, is recognize and state your needs. If drinks with your friends on this night is really important to you, recognize that, say that. Pretty straightforward here. And finally, we're horrible at managing conflict. We can do better at this. Just trying is, I think, a really good first step. So that's it for this relationship video, and the next one is on happiness, and I will see you